getting all this into 10 minutes is tough, so I'm going to, as the song says, don't bore you and skip to the chorus for most of the stuff. So the things I wanted to look at were the barriers and facilitators, as neonatal nurses saw them in terms of accessing and engaging with professional development and education. So I went off and I looked at some literature. Now, there weren't any studies that looked at neonatal intensive care units, so there's clearly a gap in information there about what neonatal nurses think about this. I found about 509 articles out there and managed to whittle them down to 11 from a number of countries that had similar professional regulatory frameworks to the UK, so we could get some comparable information, specifically focusing on nurses and midwives and who work in hospitals. Although, as I said, there was no neonatal intensive care units there, but it gave us some information. There was a range of study types there, from qualitative to quantitative, case study and systematic review. The barriers, first of all, and I'm going to touch on this quickly and move on, because I want to focus on what the facilitators were. You'll recognise many of these. Personal constraints, that work-life balance that people are trying to achieve can be a problem for people. Time, costs, both problems for people personally and for the organisation in terms of being able to give time people to do things, finding time to be able to study, being able to afford travel to things like this, being able to afford to do courses, anything from online things all the way up to degree level courses. So time and cost, significant barriers. The kind of education that was available, relevance was a really important barrier, and people really wanted things that were either personally or professionally relevant to them. People who hadn't studied for a long time, or whose initial training perhaps was at a lower educational level, or had poor digital literacy skills, really struggled to even think about accessing education because they didn't have confidence in their ability to be able to do it. And of course, staffing was an issue, which I'm sure you'll all be aware of, having enough people to let them out and actually go and do things. But overriding all of this was workplace culture. So combinations of people who perhaps had negative attitudes towards education, and that debate about compassion versus being clever, which is still out there, believe it or not. People being perhaps apathetic or disillusioned, particularly in the presence of disempowering leadership styles. And then there's the oblivious, people who really didn't make the link between education, professional accountability, and patient outcomes. So those are all the barriers. We'll move past those quickly. What actually helps? So in terms of the literature review, it was quite difficult to articulate some of the facilitators, but certainly being personally or intrinsically motivated to go and do something really helped, especially in the presence of a supportive family environment, and it being the right time for you. Higher values placed on CPD when you have a self-image of being an adaptable person. And that's something I think that we can bring out in people, that feeling of being adaptable. And the more money that an organisation or the more resource an organisation puts into education, the more highly valued it is by the individual. It's a bit of a put your money where your mouth is situation. Education's really important again, so the level of education you have influences how much you engage with further education. So if you have a degree or a master's level qualification, you're more likely to go off and do more. So if you're educated, then you tend to seek education, and if you have education, you seek to be educated. So it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation. How do we tap into that self-perpetuating loop? Well, again, workplace culture, really important factor in getting people to engage with education and wanting to achieve that higher level. And one of the key things is a culture that really values professional growth and self-development, particularly when it involves individual choice. So any education actually, whether it's a degree in English literature or whether it's a clinical thing, encourages people to engage with the kind of education you want them to have. So education begets education, effectively. And it's really important to have a supportive management culture. People who want to facilitate individual choice and to demonstrate a willingness to change and also facilitate learning and practice. I know I'm rocketing through this because I know 10 minutes isn't a long time to see all of this. So it's a busy slide. What this is all of the stuff you need to learn if you work in a neonatal intensive care unit. So I did a scoping exercise across Scotland, and there is a lot on there, and it is quite overwhelming. So I'm not going to tell you all it is. You girls out there who are working in neonatal units know what you have to do. And it involves neonatal intensive courses, it involves NALS courses, it involves reflection, it involves in-house study days, it involves all sorts of things. The question marks there are the stuff that you do that we don't know about. Your degree in English literature, perhaps. You can look at this in two ways. It's either, an opportunity or it's a requirement. In truth, it's actually both. But when you think about the amount of stuff there is to do there, you have to think about how you're going to resource that sort of commitment to education and learning that's required. So for my study, I took all of that information and I categorised it into different kinds of learning opportunity. Everything from the computer-based training programmes like LearnPro, all the way through to reflection and a number of different things in between. And used that to form the basis for some interviews and focus groups to try and get a feeling about what people feel about these kinds of different education. So we took one Scottish university, a fairly typical unit. Everyone who participated had had their neonatal intensive care qualification and specialty for at least 1 year. We had 3 groups from fairly senior charge nurses to experienced nurses, not charge nurses yet, but somewhere between 5 and 10 years experience, and some fairly junior people who had more recently gone through their neonatal intensive care course. We had 11 female participants. We would have had more, but the challenge of actually getting people off shift to come and do this meant that we had to take what was available on me. We want to know what helps you learn and what gets in the way. Again, this is a small slide, so of the 12 different types of educational opportunity, all 3 focus groups, from the seniors through to the juniors, they want planned in-house training education. They want ad hoc learning opportunities like emergencies and clinical practice. They want to go to external seminars, conferences, study days, and some of them even like a little bit of reflection. So what that tells you is that people want to hear from experts. They want to discuss things together in groups. They want to learn from their colleagues, and they want to learn and practice. And they want to have time to think about it afterwards as well. What they universally loathed is any computer-based training. Now, that obviously isn't a shock to you. Now, the thing about computer-based training is that what education science tells us about it is that even distance learning stuff needs some kind of human facilitation for it to be truly effective. And what people saw this as was more of a tick box exercise. They didn't feel it was educationally relevant to them and felt it was more of an organisational need rather than an individual learning need. But for organisations, it helps to reduce the organisational footprint because you can roll this out to a lot of people fairly easily. But when you're thinking about having an organisational footprint, because education does have resource implications, some of the things that were coming through from talking to our focus groups were that you need to consider is, in terms of education, psychological space and actual physical space. So thinking about how you can resource these things. Again, looking at some of the information from education science and how you achieve effective learning, if that's really what you want to happen. However, the psychological space, you need time. You need to give people time to reflect on things. They need to think and absorb material that they're giving them. So today we've given you little gaps and spaces to think about it. That helps you absorb things. If we just deliver lots of information over a long period of time, a lot of it won't be retained. Context is important. So people tell us they want to learn and practice. So you can demonstrate a piece of machinery, for example, but without the context of using that machinery in practice, it's very unlikely people are going to remember how it works when they actually need to come to use it. So thinking about ways you can get around that. Repetition is important. In terms of this project, if you tell everyone in your unit that you're doing this once, then you would be lucky if all of them managed to remember that by the following week. So saying things again and again and again. Giving information in small bites as well. Lots of information can get lost if you try and do very long study days, in particular if you are lucky enough to be able to run things like that. Think about how you can break things up for people to give them time to absorb and reflect. And recall and testing is really important too. And it's strategies that have been demonstrated to help students when they come to study and for exams, is before you deliver information, get people to recall what they actually know about it first. They can do that individually, and then they work together as groups to help build that information up, and then you build on top of that with the new information or reminders that they need of the stuff that they've forgotten. And that's very helpful in terms of that psychological space. So physical space, again, it's a resource-orientated thing. If you don't actually have physical space, this is hard to achieve, but people really feel the absence of a physical space to learn. And if the organisation doesn't resource it, sometimes feel like the organisation perhaps doesn't value your learning. So think about how you might be able to provide a learning area that's resourced in some way. A computer is a resource, of course. People might be able to share books and journals. It should be free from interruption. No alarms, no phones, no parents coming to ask a question, somewhere away from the clinical area that's quiet. And when I say separate from other pursuits, then it shouldn't be your coffee room. It shouldn't be your home space. It shouldn't be your workspace. It should be something ideally that's a learning space. Now, that's a challenge for you guys to think about how you actually accommodate that. Now, I'm making up the footprint analogy here, you'll see it as you go, but to help you underpin that idea of support in physical and psychological space, in terms of the feedback we got from our focus groups, is about recognising that sustained and sustainable education and development does require investment, but it does have tangible benefits. How can you equitably support any and all types of learning, not just the stuff that's relevant to your clinical environment, because education begets education. So how can you encourage or reward or congratulate or acknowledge that people are learning? Thinking about how you can encourage that open culture that acknowledges the potential there for gaps and tries to identify that gaps and allows people to admit to their gaps so that you can address the gaps more effectively. Consider, and I use that word carefully, the relative value and the need for mandatory computer training. Are you really getting what you think you're getting from all those Learn Pro modules? If people genuinely feel like they're learning from them, then great. But if they feel like all they're doing is using up the time that they could be using to learn something else more effectively, then think about the value there. And staff see themselves as a resource, very much from the junior all the way up to the senior people. They feel that they have different attributes to share. So tap into their strengths and their interests, but ask them what they are first. Champions do work if the champion actually is truly invested in the thing they are championing. If you ask them to do something but they're not really sure about it, or if it's not really their thing, then you're unlikely to get the result that you desire from that. Thank you. That was a long 10 minutes.